Hello, everyone. My name is Ridhima Kumar, Manager Scientific Writing for Medical Device Solutions Group at Cactus Life Sciences. Today, we're going to be talking about alignment across EU MDR deliverables. Essentially, we'll get into some of the key clinical deliverables that the EU MDR requires, how we can maintain alignment across them, and why it's in our best interest to do so. So here's our broad agenda for today. I'll be getting into some of the background to understand the interdependency of the key clinical deliverables specifically. What could go wrong if we don't keep in mind the interdependency, or our deliverables end up becoming misaligned? So what are the things that could go wrong? And the risks are huge. Then we will get into some of the content and some of the areas across which we could maintain alignment across these key clinical deliverables, followed by what are some of the best practices that we could follow to maintain this alignment across these deliverables. And then we'll finally conclude with what are some of the benefits and why we should be maintaining this alignment across our deliverables, and how that's going to enable you as manufacturers to ensure that your devices continue to be on the EU market and patients continue to have access to your devices. Okay, so let's get into some of the background and understand the interdependency of deliverables. So just a little bit of a background here. We know that the EU MDR was published in May 2017, has been applicable since May 2021. What does that essentially mean for us? In short, it means a lot more work, but let's get into some of the major themes here that the MDR has. So the first thing is the introduction of new deliverables. For example, the SSCP, the Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance. There's also changes to the existing deliverables, like those coming out of the PMS, the post-market surveillance, and the PMCF, post-market clinical follow-up functions. There's also changes to the way we have been doing things previously. So for example, there are substantial challenges in taking the equivalence approach, for example, here. There's a lot more that the EU MDR obviously has, but what I want to focus on today is the deliverables, the requirements of the deliverables, and the requirements the requirements of the number of deliverables that we have, and what are the requirements for each of those deliverables. So let's focus on those things first here. So let's look at the key clinical deliverables that we have. On the clinical evaluation side, we have the clinical evaluation plan, the clinical evaluation report, the summary of safety and clinical performance. On the post-market surveillance side, we have all of these deliverables: the post-market surveillance plan, the post-market clinical follow-up plan, periodic safety update report, post-market surveillance report, and the post-market clinical follow-up evaluation report. So, in my experience of working with a lot of manufacturers, both, from some of the largest folks in the industry to several small manufacturers, what I've noticed is not a lot of them are concerned about the smaller deliverables here, like the CEP or the PMS plan. That's I think we have that a little sorted out. But what most of them are concerned about is three major deliverables: the CER, the SSCP, and the PSUR. These are some of the heftier deliverables of the lot, some of the more complex deliverables that we have. So, most of the time when I'm interacting with manufacturers, most of the questions are around these, that, what do we do about these? How do we plan these deliverables? What are the contents that are going into these deliverables? The PSUR especially, because we don't have a final guidance yet. So these are the ones that I want to focus on today here for my presentation. But before we get into that, let's take a quick look at, it's the same thing that I presented on my previous slide, just presented slightly differently here. We could group those deliverables into these four major functions: clinical evaluation, SSCP, PMCF, and PMS. And what we want to appreciate here is how all of these are interlinked with each other. So it's not that, I've seen that manufacturers, the different departments for these functions, and most of the time they're working in silos, probably collaborating towards the end. And what ends up happening is that doesn't work out, right? So what we want to do is understand these interconnectivities and these links beforehand so that we can plan in advance. Now, I don't want to get into the details of, exactly how they're interlinked, and, I'll probably get into that a little bit later. but just, so that we understand the bigger picture here, that all of these are interdependent and all of these are linked to each other. So, this interconnectivity, this could either be a good thing or a bad thing for us. So let's take a look at what are some of the risks that could be caused if we don't pay attention to the interconnectivity or if our deliverables become misaligned. So the major risk here we have is non-compliance with the EU MDR. And while we may think that, okay, fine, we don't comply, we'll fix it. It's not that simple, because that you end up having a big business impact here. You might have to go through multiple rounds of questions with the notified body. You might potentially lose access to the EU market or not get access at all, depending on whether it's a new device or a device that's already been on the market. It also has an impact to healthcare. So patients would not end up having access to your devices, or may end up losing access to your devices. So finally, that's why we develop these medical devices. We want patients to have access to these devices. So we want to make sure that all of this work that we're doing, keep this bigger picture in mind and make sure that patients finally get access to our medical devices. Even if it all goes right, in the best case, there's going to be an inefficiency in the way we're doing our work. Because if we don't look at the interconnectivity from the beginning, we are going to, there's going to be work that we're going to have to do over and over again, something that we could potentially do all at once if we understand the interconnectivity and the interdependency and probably the overlap across these deliverables. So that's one thing. Another thing is that, if multiple people are working on, these different deliverables, seemingly different deliverables, there's going to be inconsistency in the way things are done. There's going to be an ambiguity, and notified bodies are going to come back with questions then. So, as I think that this is most likely going to happen if we have different people working on different deliverables, because no two people write the same, right? And I think as professionals working with regulatory documents, we understand the importance of verbiage. So if, just by changing a phrase or even a single word, we may end up introducing some connotations unintentionally. And that's going to, at the very least, lead to confusion at the notified bodies. And, it's the same data. It's presented in two different ways in two different documents. What are you trying to say? So you're going to have to then, invest more time, more resources in answering these questions, because it's not necessarily that you've not complied with the MDR. You've said the right things, but it's just confusing. So you're going to have to spend more time and resources figuring this out, answering questions, resources that could have otherwise been used, to do the gazillion other things that MDR requires us to do. Okay, so I hope I've not scared you too much there with these risks, because there is a simple solution here. Maintaining alignment right from the get-go. So what we're going to do now is look into some of the content and look at the areas across which we could maintain alignment across the key deliverables. So the three deliverables that we spoke about at the beginning, the CER, the SSCP, and the PSUR. I'll get into those deliverables and talk about how we can, what are the areas that overlap and how we can maintain alignment across those. So now on this slide, before I display this, I do want to give a slight disclaimer. So just stay with me on this slide, because I'm going to be displaying the CER, SSCP, and PSUR in a format that you've probably not seen before. So I'm not going to be presenting like 836 pages worth of a document here. What I've done is concisely presented the key contents of these deliverables in a slightly graphical format. So we have the CER here, and it's okay if you can't read what's on the slide, and I'll get into that in my later slides. But what I've done here essentially is looked at the key content, or actually all of the content at a very high level that goes into the CER, the clinical evaluation report. The purpose of my slide here is so that we can appreciate the amount of overlap that exists across the key deliverables that we talked about. So if we look at the second circle here for the SSCP, the summary of safety and clinical performance, we can see how much of an overlap there is across the CER and the SSCP. Almost everything is the same. All your data is the same. So it makes you wonder why you're not doing that all together, right? I think I would say that for the SSCP, it's still a little bit well understood across the industry that the CER and the SSCP go hand in hand, because the SSCP is the summary of safety and clinical performance, which essentially means the summary of the CER, if we understand that. So I think manufacturers are still doing the CER and the SSCP together. But what's surprising here is the amount of overlap that there is with the PSUR, the Periodic Safety Update Report. So almost all of the content you can see is overlapping with the CER and the SSCP. I think it's just a couple of things, the usage frequency, the characteristics of patient population, just a couple of things that you need to draft from scratch. So you can maintain alignment across these deliverables if you keep in mind, all of these requirements from the get-go. You can maintain alignment and you will be able to just leverage sections from one document to the other, and you won't have to draft this from scratch. So imagine how efficient that would be to draft your PSUR if you just have to draft 2 sections at the end of the day. So where does all of this information come from? Not surprisingly, it's all coming from the same data sources. And again, I don't want to get into, I don't want you to read everything that's on this slide, because in my next slide, let me just get into that. I will present this whole thing in a tabular format. So you can see the reference to the graphic on the right-hand side. What I've done here is just opened up that circle in a tabular format. So this is specifically for the CER. The first column on the left is the source documents or the information sources that we would use to write our CER. The second column talks about the key content that we're going to be deriving out of these source documents. And then the third column shows you where this information is feeding into your deliverable. So in this case, it's the CER. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the first part of it, the IFUs, the manuals, the technical files, these are the source documents that give us information regarding equivalence, the type and class of the device description, labeling information, all of which feeds into the scope of the CER. And then we need data for supporting a subject device. So where does that come from? That's coming from your V&V reports, preclinical reports, clinical study reports, complaint handling, and also part of it from published literature. So all of that information feeds into data that supports your subject device. And then we have data for the state of the art that's also coming from published literature. So data for the medical condition, treatment options, benefits, risks, advantages, disadvantages for all of your alternatives, clinical data on similar devices, acceptance criteria, potentially. Most of the time, I think the acceptance criteria we're deriving from the state-of-the-art literature, unless there's another strategy, but most of the time the acceptance criteria is also derived from published literature, any technological advancements, all of that feeds into the state-of-the-art. We also have characteristics of patient population. That's not something that goes into the CER, but that's something that goes into the PSUR. But again, one thing to note here is that we're still getting this information from the same published literature. So if we do all of it all together, we can just do it at once, and we don't have to do it over and over again. The next thing for claims. So we get the claims matrix as our source from where we get the claims that we substantiate in the CER. There's information from finance and marketing. The sales part of it goes into the CER. The usage frequency part of it potentially feeds into the PSUR. We have risk documentation, the risk assessment reports that help us analyze the information. And then the last piece here is the emergent content that we're specifically drafting for the CER. So this is not something that we're deriving from pre-existing source documents. This is the stuff that we're actually authoring for the CER. As we all know, as per the MDR, it's not just a summarization of data. So the CER requires us to do a thoughtful analysis of all of the data. So once we've put together all of the data that we just discussed above, we look at the benefits of the device. We look at the risks of the device. Is the benefit-risk ratio acceptable? Are there any side effects? Are those side effects acceptable? What are the safety and performance measures that we're looking at? What are the outcomes that we're seeing? Comparing it with the risk documentation, are we still within our acceptable limits, or do we need to update our risk documentation? So all of those things, all of that analysis that we're doing for the CER, that's part of the last piece here that we're presenting, the emergent content. Again, this is something that would also feed into other deliverables, but if we do it correctly once, we could just end up leveraging. So I have the same table for the SSCP. I won't go into too much detail here. We've already gone through it, but what I do want you to appreciate here is it's the same sources. So the first 2 columns, like you see, they're not changing. It's just the last column here. So we're looking at the same information, the same source documents, the same content. It's just feeding into different sections of the different deliverables. So it's if we just understand this, we will be able to maintain alignment, and we will be able to do this much more efficiently. So similarly for the PSUR, it's the same thing. The only thing additional, like I had also mentioned previously, the characteristics of the patient population and the usage frequency. Those are the only additional things that we have for the PSUR. And then this is how this all comes together. So I hope now it's a little clearer what this graphic means. If you'd like to, look at a blown up version of this, you can also visit our booth. So I think there's an infographic there that you can look at. There's also an interactive version of this graphic up on our website. You can also have a look at a demo of that interactive PDF at our booth. You can use this as reference for working on your deliverables. All right, so what I want to get into now is how do we maintain this alignment? I think what we've understood so far is that there are these three huge deliverables that we're all dealing with. We know that we want to maintain alignment across these three huge deliverables. We've looked at the overlapping content across these deliverables. So we know that it is possible to just do it all at once and not have to repeat the effort over and over again, making it also easier for notified bodies to review your documents. But how exactly do we do that? So let's get a little bit into that. So some of you, I don't know if any of you are from a business background, but people from a business background may be aware of the PDCA cycle: plan, do, check, and act. It's pretty intuitive, pretty straightforward. So this is just the process that you would follow anytime you want to introduce any changes or the whole process flow here. So what we want to do here is at every stage of this cycle, just keep in mind that the overlap that we just discussed, keep the overlap in mind and introduce a few minor modifications here and there so that we can actually achieve our goals of maintaining alignment. So at the planning stage, we can define the sequence of our deliverables, considering the interdependency. So the timelines that we plan out for our deliverables for each product, we can plan them out in such a way that we keep this interdependency and the interconnectivity in mind. So what needs to be done first versus later, all of those things can be kept in mind. Secondly, we need to plan to involve all the relevant departments because, it's at least at the approval stage, I would say, if not right from the beginning. I think it's best to involve everybody once at the beginning, once towards the end. It works most efficiently that way. So we are all aligned on what everybody is doing and how we're proceeding. So I think involving all relevant departments and resources would be a very important point here. At the implementation stage, we want to develop compliant templates, which essentially means, so we talked about the overlap, we talked about how we want to maintain alignment. We talked about the different sections that are actually overlapping with each other. But it's not that simple that, we just say that, okay, fine, we have a clinical literature section here, we have a clinical literature section here, it's the same. It's not exactly like that. If we look at, zoom into the regulations and look at some of the deeper intricacies there, we'll notice that the requirements may slightly differ even between the CER and the SSCP. The amount of detail that's required may slightly differ. So we do need to develop templates that comply with all of these deliverables if we want to maintain alignment across them, right? So we could also add more deliverables here. So I focused here only on these three key huge deliverables that are currently causing such a problem in the industry. But we could also add more deliverables and make sure that our templates that we develop comply with all of the requirements. The second thing to keep in mind is we could develop standalone documents that could be shared across these key deliverables, which essentially means that literature, like I said, literature can be used across documents. So we could develop a literature review report as a standalone document. We could also develop, say, a complaint report as a standalone document, and that those documents could be shared across our deliverables. So that way we know that we're using the same source document. We're not conducting literature reviews over and over again. We're using the same source document, the same evaluation period, the same analysis, the same summaries. So that would help maintain our alignment across deliverables. The next thing is to use the same raw data. Now that this is something that's, from a personal experience, I've noticed that when we're working on a single product with different departments, one of the departments may pull in, for example, complaints data until Feb 2022, and the other may pull in data until Jan 2022. So the requirement for the data pull is pretty similar, but because they're working in silos and because they're not communicating with each other, we end up doing the analysis over and over again. So that's double the analysis effort just for a 1 month gap. So that communication needs to happen, and we need to analyze the same raw data across our deliverables. And then finally, we need to ensure that we're training individuals who are working on these documents on a day-to-day basis, training them on the bigger picture, training them on why they're doing what they're doing, or why they've been asked to do things a certain way. Because that, once they know why they're doing what they're doing, compliance would become a lot easier. And of course, training has a lot of benefits. I cannot possibly exhaustively cover those benefits, but definitely training is going to contribute towards maintaining alignment. The next step then is to put checks in place. I cannot stress the importance of quality check enough, given the complexity of data and the amount of deliverables we're working on. We absolutely need to have a quality check in place to make sure that there's consistency. I mean, of course, we need a quality check for several reasons, but specifically keeping this requirement in mind, we need a quality check in place to ensure that there's consistency between your subject document and the source document. So essentially your deliverable and the sources from which you're deriving information for your deliverable. So there has to be a consistency there. There has to be consistency across different sections within the same document. Now, these documents, specifically the CER, SSCP, and PSUR that I talked about, these documents are huge, right? So you may spend weeks writing the document, and by the time you're on the third week, you've forgotten what you've done in the first week. You've potentially introduced some misalignment in some way. Verbiage throughout the document has to be aligned. So we need a QC in place to make sure that that's all done. Not just when you're working individually. I think even when these documents are, they do require cross-functional input. So they do undergo multiple rounds of reviews internally before they're submitted. So when you've been asked to make a certain change in one place, there are a lot of dependent sections that then need to be updated. So there needs to be a quality check in place to ensure that all of these things are taken care of. Finally, to check that there's consistency for your data, consistency in data alignment, data analysis and interpretation. So the same data, like we've seen, it's the same data that's going into different deliverables. So if we analyze the same data differently in different places, that's going to lead to confusion. I mean, we do say that the analysis is objective, but when we're looking at clinical data, there's some piece of clinical judgment that goes into it. That's going to introduce a little bit of subjectivity. I would say no two writers would analyze the same data exactly the same. And there's nothing wrong in that, like as long as you have a rationale for why you're doing what you're doing, as long as you're able to explain yourself, there's nothing wrong in that. But because we're looking at deliverables for the same product across, a realm of functions, we do want to make sure that for the same product, the same data is analyzed similarly. So we need a quality check in place to ensure that as well. Finally, it's always important to take a step back to assess that all of the processes that you've put in place, they're all contributing towards meeting your greater organizational objectives. All of these processes are scalable. So I'm going to conclude here with some of the benefits and keys for success. So the major benefit here for aligning your deliverables is compliance with EU MDR. So, like we discussed earlier, the business impact and the healthcare impact is then avoided. Your devices will continue to have access to the EU market. Patients will continue to have access to your devices. There's going to be efficiency in workflow. in two ways, right? Like, the first time that you're doing the deliverable, you're not spending a whole lot of time doing developing those deliverables the first time if you're understanding the overlaps and if you understand how you can do things more efficiently the first time around. And also in terms of fewer questions from notified bodies, fewer rounds of reviews with notified bodies. So there you're building an efficiency. And how do we maintain that, and how do we make sure we do that? It's just by following that simple PDCA cycle, being mindful about alignment during that PDCA cycle. So focus on the overall quality plans, your sequence of deliverables, and involving all of the cross-functional team members. Focus on that. Develop compliant templates, work on standalone documents, and training for efficient workflow. And make sure to quality check your documents. And of course, the stepping back and reassessing and making sure that everything is in place always stands. All right, yeah, thank you all for your time. I'll conclude my presentation with that.
If we don't have a question, I have a question to you, Ridhima. So you mentioned it's lovely graphical overview. I always say you can present and share how things could be done, but what is reality? How could you implement that in an organization? So what you just present to us, can we cross-reference? Can we use that when we talk to notified bodies? Or how can we get to that point that we can achieve compliance? And is it acceptable by every notified body as well?
Sure. I think, yes, so the graphic that I presented, that can definitely be used as reference. I've prepared that graphic keeping in mind the EU MDR requirements referring to the MDCG guidances. So that graphic can definitely be used as reference, and you can definitely keep that as your reference point to develop your deliverables. What's one thing to keep in mind though, and I think I previously mentioned that even though the graphic says that some of the sections are exactly overlapping, for example, your clinical literature or clinical investigation section across the CER and SSCP are overlapping, the requirements are different. So it's important to keep those requirements in mind, and as long as we can, follow. So for example, for clinical investigations, if we look at the SSCP, it has very specific requirements for summarizing your clinical investigations. If we follow the same format for the CER, then we don't need to do it twice. So we just need to keep in mind that the requirements may be slightly different. Look into that a little bit, but definitely this graphic can be used as a reference to develop and align your deliverables.
I think you're raising a very important point, and we still have additional questions from the audience. Just one comment from my side. We need to consider that small operation can solve the problem differently than big operation. Global operation can solve it completely different as well. You mentioned the topic of not talking to each other. It's a very big, complex system when you get in a big operation who has like multiple teams across the globe acting on a similar topic. So this creates problems in the implementation. I think the idea is great, the intention is great, the message is well received. The question is, how can I implement it for my organization? And this is what you need to take as a message with you back and decide internally how to do it. We have a question from the audience, please.
Exactly, following your question, how to implement it, and I found out it's not only about consistency between input documents for clinical evaluation report. There is a series of regulatory documents which are submitted as part of MDR submission, which are specific to typically regulatory affairs department, and they're often writing this content on their own or copying it from other documents. So the level of complexity is even bigger than just CER. How do you ensure this consistency? Do you use any software, or do you cross-check each document? And manual cross-checking, I realize, is prone to mistakes. One can forget many things. What's your method? What's your tool?
So I think that, it's definitely important to cross-check and to maintain alignment across the deliverables, not just the source documents and the subject document, like you mentioned. I think there's a whole lot of complexity that goes behind these documents. There's a whole lot of interpretation of the regulation that goes behind, when you're trying to write different sections of each of the documents. There's a lot of thought that goes behind it. I wouldn't recommend any software at this point to check that, because I think a manual intervention is definitely needed. Of course, probably we can do a first pass by a software, but a manual intervention is definitely needed. My recommendation is to look at it, like there could be human errors, you're right. And the way to avoid human errors is by introducing another level of check. So, you have those multiple layers. So that's why I mentioned the quality check piece here. So once the writer who's writing these documents finishes their job, we have a separate team, a separate person cross-checking all of these details, so that we're trying to circumvent the human error piece of it here. If we have a software check this, I think that it could get a little more complex. What are the details that you're going to give to the software? But I think a manual intervention is definitely needed when we're dealing with such complex level of data.
Yeah, so thank you for answering. We still have some questions here from the audience. You are raising much more attention based on your reaction. So please, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. You mentioned a lot about the QC process and the alignment of documents. How do you handle the review process? Because the reviewers of a CER versus an SSCP, for example, are very different. You would never consider a legal review of a CER. However, SSCP is an externally facing document. If they find an issue with the language, how do you avoid the rework back into the CER? At what level do you get them engaged? Any comments there?
Yeah, I think it's important to work on the CER and SSCP parallelly for this. Parallelly in the sense that, we stagger it a little bit. The SSCP comes after the CER. So we stagger it a little bit. We work on them sort of parallelly. So the review processes happen parallelly then. So every time if you get feedback on the SSCP, that's going to feed into the CER then at that point. You already have the CER with you. You're simultaneously working on the CER. So it's not that you have the CER done and signed off and then you're working on the SSCP. So I think the key here would be to plan out timelines in such a way that you have both the documents at hand when you're receiving reviews for both of these documents, and then you, as in the writer or the author of the document, can take a call of how to maintain alignment across these while also incorporating review comments.
I think there is an important summary out of that when we listen to what we are discussing. We can't do it according to conventional methods, doing this by having every single person checking. We need to have central electronic system, which you can get the entry, you get the right people involved from the beginning. You define every process output from the beginning. You make sure that clinical evaluation is not actually created as a solely document, but also legal is considered from the beginning, to make sure that actually the output is meeting the requirement. We have a continuous process. All of these documents will be annually or even every 3 months updated, dependent on what you're gonna get from the market. So you need to make sure that the process that you are creating is not a complex process and adding complexity for your holistic life cycle, because whatever you're gonna create, you need to live, you need to show continuous compliance. And this is where I think it's important when we are looking on legislation and trying to implement, to look to it in the long term, to make sure that we ensure consistency over the time and not have one directional, one single delivery. We get an MDR certification and then we lose it again in 3 months because we cannot achieve compliance on a continuous manner. Thank you for this presentation. It was great.